Montana Territory, 1872. The last golden rays of sunlight stretched across the rolling plains, casting long shadows over the newly established town of Riverdale. The frontier was unforgiving, a place where only the resilient survived and the weak perished beneath its harsh, indifferent sky. 25-year-old Quinn Nash had learned this lesson early, carving out his existence with calloused hands and a heart he kept carefully guarded. Quinn dismounted his chestnut gelding, dust rising from his worn leather boots as they met the dry earth. His lean, muscular frame carried the unmistakable strength of a man who'd spent his life breaking wild horses and driving cattle across unforgiving terrain. Despite the frontier hardships, his face remained youthful, handsome even, with a light stubble that caught the evening sun and eyes the color of a summer storm. "The West takes more than it gives," he muttered to himself, a mantra learned from watching his father die defending their small ranch from raiders when he was just 16. Ever since, Quinn had lived by one rule: rely on no one but yourself. Attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got you killed out here where law was scarce and danger plentiful. What Quinn wanted was simple enough: to expand his modest ranch, to build something lasting on the 20 acres he'd purchased with every cent he'd saved working as a trail hand. What he refused to acknowledge was what the emptiness in his chest whispered during lonely nights beneath vast starlit skies: that perhaps a ranch filled only with cattle and horses wasn't enough to make a home. The town's general store bell jingled as Quinn pushed through the door, nodding curtly to Old Man Peterson behind the counter. He needed supplies: coffee, flour, ammunition, essentials for another month of solitude at his cabin. "Evening, Quinn," Peterson called. "Just got a shipment in from back east. Even got those horseshoe nails you've been needing." "Appreciate it," Quinn replied, his voice low and measured. His gaze drifted across the store, cataloging items on his mental list until his eyes landed on something unexpected. She stood by the fabric bolts, slender fingers tracing patterns across calico prints. 19 years old, with honey blonde hair cascading in loose waves down her back, caught in a blue ribbon that matched her simple but well-made cornflower dress. Her profile revealed delicate features: high cheekbones, a small nose dusted with freckles, and full lips curved in concentration. Quinn found himself staring, an unusual tightness in his chest. He quickly looked away, irritated by his reaction. The frontier was no place for distraction, especially not one wearing a pretty blue dress. "That's Grace Bennett," Peterson said quietly, noticing Quinn's gaze. "Just arrived on yesterday's stage. Poor thing lost her father on the journey west. Pneumonia took him in Wyoming. She's staying with her Aunt Martha for now, but folks are saying the woman's hardly welcoming." Quinn grunted noncommittally, though something about the girl's solitary figure stirred an unwelcome recognition within him. He knew too well what it meant to arrive in this unforgiving territory with dreams that died before they took root. As if sensing his attention, Grace turned, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were the warm amber of whiskey held to sunlight, and there was a quiet dignity in how she straightened her shoulders despite the grief Peterson had mentioned. She offered a small, polite nod before returning to her task. Quinn gathered his supplies quickly, eager to return to his ranch where the world made sense. As he approached the counter, the door burst open, and 3 men staggered in. Trail hands from the neighboring Carson spread, already whiskey drunk and looking for trouble. "Well, look what we found," the tallest one slurred, his gaze fixing predatorily on Grace. "New face in town. Ain't she a pretty little thing?" Grace tensed visibly, her fingers tightening on the bolt of fabric she held. Quinn saw fear flash across her features before she composed herself, turning away from the men's attention. "Leave her be," Peterson warned from behind the counter, but his aging voice carried little authority. The cowhand moved toward Grace, invading her space with a tobacco-stained grin. "What's your hurry, darlin'? Why don't you let me show you some proper Montana hospitality?" What happened next surprised Quinn more than anyone, most of all himself. Without conscious decision, he stepped between the drunk cowhand and the young woman, his posture casual, but his eyes hard as flint. "The lady's busy," Quinn said quietly. "And you're leaving?" The man's bleary eyes narrowed. "This ain't your business, Nash." "I'm making it my business." Quinn's hand didn't move toward his holstered Colt, but the implication hung in the air between them. A tense silence filled the store before the drunk cowboy spat on the floor and backed away. "Come on, boys. Store's got nothing worth buying anyhow." After they stumbled out, Quinn turned to find Grace Bennett watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like hope. "Thank you, Mr. Nash." "Quinn Nash. I appreciate your intervention, Mr. Nash, though I assure you I could have managed." Her voice was soft, but carried unexpected steel beneath its gentle cadence. Quinn nodded, feeling suddenly awkward. Men like that only understand one thing out here. "And what might that be?" she asked. "That some lines shouldn't be crossed," he answered simply, then tipped his hat and moved to pay for his supplies, determined to put distance between himself and the strange feeling her presence evoked. As he loaded his saddlebags, Quinn heard the store door open behind him. Grace Bennett stepped onto the boardwalk, her arms wrapped around a small parcel. "Mr. Nash," she called, approaching with measured steps. "I wonder if I might impose upon you for a moment more of your time?" Quinn stiffened. "Miss Bennett." My aunt's farm lies 3 miles north of town," she continued, undeterred. "I understand from Mr. Peterson that your ranch is in that direction as well. I would be grateful for an escort, as those men seem persistent." Quinn's instinct was to refuse. The last thing he needed was to play protector to some Eastern girl unprepared for frontier life. But the memory of those drunken cowhands lingered, and despite himself, he nodded. "I can take you as far as the fork in the road," he conceded. "But that's all." Something in her expression softened. "That would be more than enough, Mr. Nash." As he helped her mount his spare pack horse, Quinn told himself this was a one-time courtesy, nothing more. He couldn't afford entanglements or responsibilities beyond his own survival. The West had taught him that much. What he couldn't explain was why. As they rode north with the setting sun painting the mountains in fire, he found himself stealing glances at his companion's profile, wondering what kind of courage it took to continue westward after losing everything along the way. The journey that should have passed in silence instead filled with her quiet questions about the territory, practical inquiries about winters, growing seasons, and local dangers. She wasn't asking for idle conversation, Quinn realized. She was gathering information necessary for survival. "Why come all this way?" he finally asked as they approached the fork where their paths would diverge. Especially after. He trailed off, unsure how to reference her loss. Grace's expression remained composed, though sadness deepened the amber of her eyes. "My father believed Montana held opportunities for us that Pennsylvania could not. He was a carpenter by trade, but dreamed of open spaces." She looked out across the vast landscape. "I intend to honor that dream, Mr. Nash, even if I must do so alone." Quinn felt an unexpected admiration stir within him. "The territory isn't kind to dreams, Miss Bennett, or to those who travel alone. Then I suppose I shall have to be kind enough for both myself and Montana," she replied with the faintest smile touching her lips. "Good evening, Mr. Nash. Thank you for your escort." As she guided her borrowed horse down the northern trail, Quinn remained at the crossroads longer than necessary, watching until her figure disappeared into the gathering twilight. He told himself he was merely ensuring her safe passage, nothing more. Yet as he rode the remaining miles to his lonely cabin, Quinn found the silence heavier than it had been before. For the first time in years, the solitude he'd cultivated felt less like safety and more like an absence, one marked by honey-blonde hair and quiet determination. 3 weeks passed before Quinn returned to town, driven by necessity rather than desire. A sudden summer storm had damaged his barn roof, and repairs couldn't wait. As he tied his horse outside the lumberyard, the sound of raised voices drew his attention to the bank across the street. Grace Bennett stood on the boardwalk, her face pale but composed as she faced the bank manager, Henry Simmons, a portly man known more for his greed than his compassion. "The arrangement was with your father, Miss Bennett," Simmons was saying loudly enough for half the street to hear. "Without his carpentry skills as collateral, I cannot extend further credit. Your aunt has made it clear she won't assume responsibility." "I understand, Mr. Simmons," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation of such a public discussion. "But I only ask for 2 more weeks. I've secured employment with Mrs. Reynolds at the dressmaking shop, and words don't build houses, Miss Bennett. Your father borrowed against work he'd never complete, and I have a business to run." Quinn found himself crossing the street before he'd made any conscious decision to do so. "What's the amount?" he asked, stopping beside Grace. She turned to him, surprise evident in her amber eyes. "Mr. Nash, this isn't, what's the amount, Simmons?" Quinn repeated. The banker's expression shifted to calculation. $38.50, Mr. Nash. For materials delivered before Mr. Bennett's passing. Quinn reached into his pocket and counted out $40. "Consider it settled." "Quinn, no," Grace whispered. But he handed the money to Simmons, who took it with a satisfied nod. "A pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Nash," the banker said before retreating into his office. Grace stood rigid, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of gratitude and pride. "I cannot accept such charity. I came west to build something, not to become someone's burden." "It's not charity," Quinn replied, surprised by his own actions but unwilling to back down. "Your father was a carpenter, you said?" She nodded cautiously. "My barn roof needs repair after the storm. I'd planned to hire help from town. Instead, I'm hiring you." "Me?" Disbelief colored her voice. "I'm not a carpenter. But you know the trade, don't you? Grew up watching your father work." A flicker of understanding crossed her features. "I did. He taught me more than was proper for a daughter to know." "Then you know more than most men in this territory," Quinn said simply. "The work's yours if you want it. $40 worth, to be precise." Grace studied him with those perceptive amber eyes, and Quinn had the uncomfortable feeling she saw more than he intended to reveal. "Why would you do this, Mr. Nash? You hardly know me." The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? He'd spent years building walls against precisely this kind of involvement. "The West takes enough," he finally said. "Sometimes we have to push back." Something passed between them then, an understanding that ran deeper than words. She gave a small nod. "I accept your offer, Mr. Nash. When shall I begin?" The arrangement was meant to be temporary, 3 days of work to repair a storm-damaged roof. But 3 days stretched into a week as Quinn discovered other tasks around his modest ranch that needed attention. A broken corral fence, a door that wouldn't close properly, shelves that had never been built in his Spartan cabin. Grace arrived each morning at sunrise, riding the gentle mare she'd purchased with her first week's wages from the dressmaking shop. She wore practical clothing, a simple blouse tucked into sturdy skirts split for riding, with her honey blonde hair braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that protected her fair skin from the Montana sun. Quinn found himself unexpectedly impressed by her competence. She worked methodically, her slender hands surprisingly skilled with hammer and saw. More surprising still was the ease that gradually developed between them. Conversations that began about lumber measurements and gradually expanded to include stories of their lives before Montana. "My father believed a person should understand how things are built," Grace explained on the third day as they worked side by side on the barn roof. "He said knowing how to create means never being entirely helpless." Quinn handed her another shingle. "Wise man. He would have liked it here," she said softly, driving a nail with precise strokes. The openness, the possibility. Her eyes scanned the rolling landscape surrounding Quinn's small ranch, 20 acres of good grazing land bordered by a clear-running creek. "You've chosen well, Quinn. This land has good bones." "It's nothing much yet," he replied, oddly pleased by her assessment. "Yet," she repeated with a small smile. "That's the important word, isn't it?" By the end of the week, Quinn realized with uncomfortable clarity that his solitary routine had been irreversibly disrupted. The silence after Grace departed each evening seemed emptier than before, his cabin lonelier despite its improvements. More unsettling was his growing anticipation of her arrival each morning, the way his day oriented itself around her presence. This wasn't part of his plan. Attachment was dangerous. People left. They died. They betrayed. The frontier had taught him that survival meant self-reliance above all else. Yet as they finished the last repair on the Saturday evening, a window frame that now opened smoothly, Quinn found himself reluctant to conclude their arrangement. "Well," Grace said, wiping her hands on her apron, "I believe that fulfills our agreement. Your $40 have been fairly earned." Quinn nodded, words suddenly difficult to find. "You've done good work. Thank you for the opportunity." She hesitated, glancing around the cabin that now bore subtle touches of her influence. Organized shelves, a properly hanging door, even wildflowers in a jar on the table. "It's been," Nice to be useful again. Your aunt's farm, Quinn began awkwardly, is not truly mine, Grace finished for him. Aunt Martha made it clear my stay is temporary. She expects me to find a suitable husband or position elsewhere. A shadow crossed her features. I had hoped my father and I would build something of our own here. The words came before Quinn could stop them. I have more work, if you're interested. Proper wages this time. Her amber eyes widened slightly. What sort of work? This place. He gestured to the cabin and the land beyond. Needs more than I can do alone. I've been thinking about planting a vegetable garden, maybe adding a room to the cabin. Things I've put off. And you believe I could help with these projects? Quinn met her gaze directly. I know you can. A slow smile spread across Grace's face, the first genuine, unguarded smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her features from merely pretty to something that caught at his chest. Then I accept, Mr. Nash, she said formally, though her eyes remained bright. Shall we begin on Monday? As he watched her ride away in the golden evening light, Quinn tried to convince himself this was a practical arrangement and nothing more. He needed help, and she needed work. Simple. Yet the warmth that lingered in her absence told a different story, one he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Summer ripened toward autumn, painting the hills in gold and amber. Grace's temporary position at Quinn's ranch evolved into a steady arrangement. 3 days each week spent helping with improvements, the other days devoted to her work at the dressmaking shop in town. Each project they completed seemed to beget another, as though the land itself had awakened to possibility. A vegetable garden now flourished behind the cabin. A chicken coop housed a small flock of laying hens. The beginnings of a proper bedroom extension had been framed onto the eastern wall of the cabin. Small changes, but meaningful ones that transformed Quinn's barebones shelter into something approaching a home. More unsettling to Quinn were the changes taking place within himself. The walls he'd built after his father's death, reinforced by years of solitary wandering, had developed hairline cracks. He found himself looking forward to the days Grace arrived, enjoying their easy conversations and shared labor. He caught himself planning improvements with her preferences in mind, wondering what might make her more comfortable during her working hours. You should consider planting apple trees along the southern boundary, Grace suggested one September afternoon as they took a rare break, sharing coffee on the newly built porch. The slope catches good sun, and they'd do well there. Apple trees take years to bear fruit, Quinn pointed out. She regarded him with those perceptive eyes. Yes, they do. That's rather the point, isn't it? Planting something meant to last. Quinn stared out across his land, seeing not just what was, but what could be. It was an unfamiliar sensation after years of living day to day. I suppose it is. My father always said the best measure of hope is what we're willing to plant knowing we might not see the harvest. Her voice softened. I think that's why he wanted to come west. He was planting something for my future. Quinn studied her profile, struck by the quiet strength evident in her features. In the months he'd known her, Grace had transformed from a grieving newcomer to an integral part of Riverdale. She'd established herself at the dressmaking shop, made friends among the townspeople, and continued honoring her father's memory through the skills she'd learned at his side. You're a remarkable woman, Grace Bennett, he said before he could stop himself. She turned to him, surprise evident in her expression. What makes you say that? Most people who lose everything turn bitter. You just rebuild. A gentle smile touched her lips. We all rebuild in our own ways, Quinn. Some with hammers and nails, others by finding new connections. Her gaze held his for a moment longer than usual. Some do both. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities that both thrilled and terrified Quinn. He stood abruptly, breaking the spell. We should finish the roof beam before sundown. If Grace was disappointed by his retreat, she didn't show it. She simply nodded and followed him back to work, respecting the boundaries he continued to maintain despite their growing closeness. That evening, as Quinn watched her ride away, he acknowledged the truth he'd been avoiding. Grace Bennett had become far more than a hired helper. She had become essential, not just to his ranch, but to him. The realization was as frightening as it was inevitable. The first snow fell in early November, blanketing the rolling hills in pristine white. Quinn stood at his window, watching the flakes swirl in the pre-dawn light, worry gnawing at his gut. Grace was due to arrive that morning to help complete the cabin extension before winter truly set in, But the unexpected storm made the 3-mile journey from town treacherous. He told himself she wouldn't attempt the ride, that she had more sense than to brave such weather. Yet as the morning wore on and the storm intensified, Quinn found himself pacing, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. By midday, his concern had hardened into certainty. Saddling his most sure-footed horse, Quinn set out into the blinding snow, following the trail to town with grim determination. The journey that normally took less than an hour stretched interminably as his mount trudged through deepening drifts, wind cutting through his heavy coat. He was halfway to town when he saw her, a dark figure against the white landscape, struggling forward on foot. Quinn's heart lurched painfully at the sight of Grace, her blue cloak nearly white with snow, leading her limping mare through the storm. "Grace," he called, pushing his horse forward. She looked up, her face pale with cold, but her eyes brightening at the sight of him. "Quinn, thank goodness." He dismounted beside her, immediately shrugging off his heavy coat and wrapping it around her shoulders despite her protests. "What happened? Why are you out in this?" "Melody stepped in a hidden hole," she explained, gesturing to her mare's clearly injured leg. "It happened just as the storm worsened. I couldn't ask her to carry me, so we've been walking since." Quinn's chest tightened at how matter-of-factly she described what could have been a death sentence in the Montana winter. "You should have sought shelter, waited out the storm." "I knew you'd be waiting," she said simply. "I didn't want you to worry." The statement struck him with unexpected force, the realization that she'd risked herself partly out of concern for him. It had been so long since anyone had considered his feelings that Quinn hardly knew how to respond. "We need to get you warm," he said, helping her mount his horse while he took charge of the injured mare. "The ranch is closer than town now." The return journey passed in tense silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the labored breathing of the horses. By the time they reached the cabin, Grace's lips had taken on a bluish tint despite the coat, and she was shivering uncontrollably. Quinn worked efficiently, stoking the fire to blazing life, settling the horses in the barn, and returning to find Grace still standing where he'd left her, seemingly unable to move. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said, guiding her toward the fire. "I'll find you something dry." She nodded mutely, her usual composure cracked by cold and exhaustion. Quinn retrieved his warmest flannel shirt and a pair of wool trousers, setting them beside her before retreating to tend the horses, giving her privacy to change. When he returned, Grace sat huddled before the fire, swimming in his clothing, her honey-blonde hair released from its usual braid and spread across her shoulders to dry. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, and the sight awakened a fierce protectiveness in Quinn that shocked him with its intensity. "Thank you," she said as he handed her a steaming cup of coffee. "I fear I wasn't as prepared for Montana winters as I thought." "The first one's always a surprise," Quinn replied, settling beside her. "Even when you're expecting it." They sat in companionable silence as the storm raged outside, the cabin secure around them. Gradually, color returned to Grace's cheeks, and her shivering subsided. "I keep thinking about my father," she said softly, staring into the flames. "How he'd laugh at me now, caught unprepared by weather he warned me about for months before we left Pennsylvania." Quinn studied her profile, gilded by firelight. "You miss him?" "Every day." She turned to meet his gaze. "Do you miss your father?" The question caught him off guard. He rarely spoke of his family, but something about the moment, the intimacy of shared warmth against the howling storm, loosened his usual reserve. "Yes," he admitted, "though it's been nearly 10 years now. He wasn't a perfect man, but he taught me everything I know about surviving out here." "Except one thing," Grace said gently. "What's that?" "That surviving isn't the same as living." Her eyes held his steadily. "Your father wouldn't have wanted you to be alone forever, Quinn." The words struck too close to truths Quinn had avoided confronting. "Some people are better off alone. Safer." "Safer, perhaps," she conceded, "but hardly better off." Quinn stood abruptly, moving to add another log to the fire though it didn't need it. "The storm's not letting up. You should take the bed tonight. I'll sleep by the fire." He felt rather than saw her disappointment at his withdrawal, but Grace didn't press further. "Thank you for coming to find me today. Anyone would have done the same," he deflected. "No," she said with quiet certainty. "They wouldn't have." Later, as Quinn lay on his bedroll before the dying embers, Listening to Grace's steady breathing from the bed across the room, he confronted uncomfortable truths. The panic he'd felt upon finding her in the storm, the relief that had flooded him when he brought her safely home. These weren't the reactions of a man content with solitude. They were the responses of a man who had found something worth fearing to lose. The realization wasn't welcome. Attachment meant vulnerability. Caring meant pain when, not if, it ended. These were the lessons the frontier had taught him, reinforced by years of determined isolation. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, Quinn's last conscious thought was how right it had felt to bring Grace Bennett home through the storm. Not to his cabin, but home. The blizzard raged for 3 days, trapping them together in the cabin's confines. What should have been an uncomfortable ordeal instead unfolded as a revelation for Quinn. Grace's presence transformed the small space, filling it with conversation, shared work, and unexpected laughter. They cooked together, read from Quinn's small collection of books, and planned spring projects as though her continued presence was a certainty. Most evenings found them seated before the fire, Quinn whittling or mending tack, while Grace worked on mending his clothes, a task she'd undertaken without being asked, bringing order to years of haphazard repairs. "You never speak of your mother," Grace observed on the third night as she darned a sock with neat, precise stitches. Quinn's hand stilled on the piece of pine he was shaping. "She left when I was 8. Decided Montana territory wasn't worth the hardship." Grace's expression softened with understanding. "So she went back east?" "As far as I know. She wrote a few times, then stopped." He resumed his whittling, focusing on the wood rather than the old pain her question had awakened. "Some people aren't made for frontier life. And you believe that's why I came west? Because I was made for it?" There was gentle challenge in her voice. Quinn looked up, meeting her gaze. "I've watched you rebuild your life from nothing, Grace. I've seen you face every hardship without complaint. If anyone belongs here, you do." Something shifted in her expression, a vulnerability she rarely allowed to surface. "There are days I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake. If my father's dream has become my burden. Do you want to go back?" The question emerged harsher than he intended, revealing too much of his fear at the prospect. Grace shook her head slowly. "No. Whatever future I have, it's here now." Her eyes held his steadily, though sometimes I wonder if that future includes more than just survival. The implication hung between them, impossible to ignore in the intimate confines of the cabin. Quinn felt a familiar panic rise within him, the instinct to retreat behind his carefully constructed walls. But something had changed during these snowbound days. The possibility of life with Grace no longer seemed like a risk to be avoided, but an opportunity he might not deserve. "I'm not good at this," he finally said, gesturing vaguely between them. "Letting people in." A small smile touched her lips. "I've noticed. My father died protecting what he built. My mother abandoned it because it was too hard. Every lesson I've learned says attachment leads to pain. And every lesson I've learned says facing that pain is still better than isolation." Grace set aside her mending, leaning forward. "Quinn, I—" A sudden pounding at the door interrupted her words, startling them both. Quinn rose quickly, hand moving instinctively to the rifle propped beside the fireplace before he called out, "Who's there?" "Sheriff Miller, Quinn. Open up." Quinn exchanged a concerned glance with Grace before unbarring the door. Sheriff Robert Miller stood on the porch, snow caking his heavy coat, his expression grave. "Thank God," the sheriff said upon seeing Grace. "Half the town's been worried sick about you, Miss Bennett. When you didn't return before the storm and your aunt reported you missing." "I'm perfectly fine, Sheriff," Grace assured him, rising to stand beside Quinn. "My horse was injured on the journey here, and the storm made return impossible." The sheriff's eyes moved between them, taking in Grace's attire, still Quinn's clothes, though more modestly supplemented with her own dried garments, and their evident comfort in each other's presence. His weathered face revealed nothing, but Quinn recognized the assessment taking place. "I see," Miller said neutrally. "Well, the roads are passable again, barely. Your aunt is expecting your return, Miss Bennett. And there's been some trouble in town you should know about, Nash." "What kind of trouble?" Quinn asked, tension returning to his shoulders. "Carson's men, the ones who harassed Miss Bennett a few months back. They've been stirring up talk about her reputation, given her frequent visits out here." "Ugly talk." Grace's cheeks flushed, but she lifted her chin. People will gossip regardless of truth, Sheriff. Maybe so, Miller agreed. But Carson himself arrived yesterday, and he's got his eye on your property, Nash. Seems he thinks 20 acres adjoining his northern pasture would round out his holdings nicely. Having his men spread rumors that might encourage you to move on. Well, it wouldn't be the first time he's used such tactics. Quinn's jaw tightened. William Carson was the largest rancher in the county, with a reputation for expanding his empire by whatever means necessary, legal or otherwise. If he'd set his sights on Quinn's land, the rumors about Grace were likely just the opening salvo. I appreciate the warning, Quinn said grimly. The sheriff nodded. I'll escort Miss Bennett back to town. You might want to ride in yourself tomorrow, Quinn. Sometimes showing your face is enough to quiet the worst talk. Grace gathered her few belongings silently, the easy intimacy of moments before shattered by the intrusion of outside reality. As she prepared to leave with the sheriff, she turned to Quinn, her expression troubled. Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Nash, she said formally, conscious of Miller's presence. And for coming to my aid during the storm. Quinn wanted to say more, to finish the conversation the sheriff had interrupted, to make some claim on the future they'd begun to envision together during the snowbound days. But the specter of Carson's interference and the town's gossip had reawakened all his doubts. So he merely nodded, watching as the sheriff led Grace away, the snow-laden sky already darkening toward evening. Alone again in his cabin, Quinn found the silence oppressive rather than comforting. Every corner held evidence of Grace's presence. The neatly folded quilt, the organized shelves, the half-finished extension they'd been building together. For the first time, he could clearly see the choice before him. Retreat back into solitary safety, or fight for something, someone, worth the risk. By morning, Quinn had made his decision. Riverdale bustled with activity as Quinn rode in the following day, the town emerging from its weather-enforced isolation with renewed energy. He tied his horse outside the general store, aware of the curious glances and hushed conversations that followed his progress down the main street. Inside, Peterson greeted him with uncharacteristic reserve. Morning, Quinn. Heard you had company during the storm. Grace Bennett's horse was injured. Quinn replied evenly, selecting supplies with deliberate calm. I'd have done the same for anyone caught in that blizzard. Course you would. The shopkeeper agreed too quickly. But not everyone sees it that way. Martha Bennett's been talking up a storm about her niece's reputation being compromised. And those Carson boys have been suggesting more happened than just neighborly shelter. Quinn's hand tightened on the sack of coffee beans he'd been examining. Grace Bennett is one of the finest women in this territory. Anyone suggesting otherwise will answer to me. Peterson's eyebrows rose at the intensity of Quinn's response. Might be too late for that. Word is Carson himself called on Martha this morning with a proposition. What kind of proposition? Quinn demanded, an icy feeling spreading through his chest. The marrying kind, Peterson said bluntly. For Grace. His oldest son Thomas has been widowed a year now, needs a mother for his young ones. Carson's offering Martha a hefty sum to encourage the match, and everyone knows she's eager to be relieved of her niece's care. The news hit Quinn like a physical blow. Thomas Carson was nearly 40, a hard man cut from the same ruthless cloth as his father. The thought of Grace tied to such a family, used as a pawn in Carson's land-grabbing schemes, was intolerable. Where would I find Grace now? Quinn asked, abandoning all pretense of casual shopping. Dressmaking shop, most likely, Peterson replied, watching him carefully. Quinn, if you're thinking of interfering, Carson isn't a man who takes kindly to opposition. Neither am I, Quinn said grimly, laying money on the counter before striding out. The dressmaking shop occupied a small storefront near the town's southern end. Quinn hesitated outside, suddenly uncertain. What right did he have to intervene in Grace's decisions? Perhaps she would welcome the security of marriage to the Carson family, despite Thomas's reputation. Before he could resolve his doubts, the shop door opened, and Grace herself emerged, looking pale and determined. She stopped short at the sight of Quinn, her amber eyes widening in surprise. Quinn, what are you doing here? I heard about Carson's offer, he said without preamble. His son Thomas. Grace's expression clouded. News travels quickly in Riverdale. Is it true? Are you considering it? She glanced around at the busy street, conscious of curious onlookers. This isn't the place for such a discussion. Then where? Quinn pressed. Because I need to know if you're planning to marry into the family of a man who's actively trying to drive me from my land. Hurt flashed across her features. Is that all you're concerned about? Your land? No, Quinn admitted, stepping closer. That's not all. Before she could respond, a large man rounded the corner, William Carson himself, flanked by two of his cowhands. In his 50s with iron-gray hair and cold eyes, Carson carried himself with the arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way. Miss Bennett, Carson called, his gaze flicking dismissively over Quinn. I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer. Grace straightened, her composure returning as she faced the rancher. I have, Mr. Carson, and I must decline. Carson's expression hardened. Perhaps you misunderstand the opportunity being presented. My son can provide security few in this territory could match. I understand perfectly, Grace replied calmly, and my answer remains no. Quinn felt a surge of admiration for her quiet strength, even as he recognized the danger of Carson's growing anger. This wouldn't have anything to do with your association with Nash here, would it? Carson asked, his tone making the word association sound indecent. Because I should warn you, his hold on that little parcel of land is more tenuous than you might think. Quinn stepped forward, positioning himself slightly before Grace. My deed is legal and filed with the territorial office, Carson. You can check yourself. Deeds can be challenged, Carson replied coldly, especially when a property owner's judgment might be questionable. A man living alone for years suddenly taking in an unmarried woman during a storm gives people cause to wonder about his character. The implication was clear. Carson intended to use the rumors about Grace to discredit Quinn's standing in the community, potentially challenging his right to his land. Quinn provided shelter during a blizzard. Grace interjected, anger coloring her tone. Nothing more. That's not how my men tell it, Carson said with false regret. And not how your aunt believes it happened, either. His gaze hardened. Reputation is a fragile thing, Miss Bennett. Once damaged, it's nearly impossible to repair, as I'm sure your aunt has explained. Quinn felt rather than saw Grace's flinch at the mention of her aunt. Martha Bennett had clearly made her position known. Either Grace accepted the Carson proposal, or she would find herself without even that tenuous family connection. Something broke inside Quinn, the last of his resistance to the truth he'd been fighting for months. Carson might take his land. The town might believe the worst of both of them. But he would not stand by while Grace was manipulated through fear and gossip. There's been no impropriety because Grace Bennett is going to be my wife, Quinn declared, his voice carrying clearly down the street. Silence fell as townsfolk stopped to stare. Grace turned to him, shock evident in her expression. Carson recovered first, his cold eyes narrowing. Is that so? Strange time to announce such intentions, Nash. Not strange at all, Quinn replied steadily, though his heart hammered in his chest. I came to town today specifically to make my intentions official. He turned to Grace, whose amber eyes were wide with surprise and something else, something that gave him courage to continue despite their audience. Grace, he said more quietly, taking her gloved hand in his. I should have asked you properly, privately. But I won't stand by while people question your honor or try to force your hand. Her fingers tightened around his. Quinn, you don't have to do this. I know I don't have to, he replied, surprising himself with his certainty. I want to, if you'll have me. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Grace simply looked at him, searching his face for the truth behind his impulsive declaration. Then, slowly, she nodded. Yes, Quinn, I will. Carson's face darkened with anger. This changes nothing, Nash. That land is mine, Quinn interrupted firmly. Mine and now Grace's. And we intend to keep it. Taking Grace's arm, Quinn guided her away from the fuming rancher, aware that every eye in Riverdale was upon them. Neither spoke until they reached his horse, sheltered in the relative privacy beside the general store. Did you mean it? Grace asked quietly, her composure finally cracking to reveal vulnerability beneath. Or was it merely a convenient solution to Carson's interference? Quinn took her hands in his, suddenly certain in a way he hadn't been about anything since his father's death. I meant every word. Though I'd planned a more private proposal, preferably one not witnessed by half the territory. A smile trembled on her lips. You've spent months keeping me at arm's length, Quinn Nash. Forgive me if I find this sudden declaration somewhat surprising. The storm changed things, he admitted. Seeing you in my home, building something together, it made me realize what I've been fighting against all these years. And what's that? The possibility that some things are worth the risk of loss. He drew a deep breath. I love you, Grace Bennett. I think I have since that first day in Peterson's store. I just didn't know how to accept it. Tears gathered in her amber eyes. I've been waiting months to hear those words. I'm sorry it took so long, Quinn said, brushing a tear from her cheek. And I'm sorry our engagement had to happen this way. You deserve better. No, Grace replied, her voice strengthening. This is exactly right. Standing together against those who would separate us. That's what marriage truly means. Her expression softened. I love you too, Quinn. Enough to wait until you were ready to see it. Before he could respond, the church bell began to toll, its clear notes ringing across the town. Quinn glanced toward the white steeple, then back to Grace. Reverend Adams holds services on Wednesday afternoons, he said slowly. We could make this official today, if you wanted. Unless you'd prefer a proper wedding with. Grace silenced him with a finger to his lips. I don't need a fancy wedding, Quinn. I just need you. The simplicity of her statement humbled him. After years of believing attachment meant weakness, Quinn finally understood. With Grace, commitment wasn't a burden but a source of strength. Then let's go see the Reverend, he said, offering her his arm. I won't be your burden. Grace whispered that evening as they stood on the porch of their cabin, for it was truly theirs now, sanctified by the simple ceremony Reverend Adams had performed before a hastily gathered crowd of curious townsfolk. The winter stars spread across the Montana sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet, the air so clear and cold it hurt to breathe deeply. Quinn drew his new wife closer, wrapping his coat around them both. You could never be a burden, Grace, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. From the moment you walked into my life, you've been nothing but a blessing. My greatest blessing. She turned in his arms to face him, her amber eyes luminous in the starlight. Even knowing that Carson won't give up easily, that we may face more challenges because of this. Especially knowing that, Quinn assured her. Some things are worth fighting for. Her smile was answer enough as he lifted her into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their home. Not just a cabin now, but the foundation of a shared future neither had dared imagine alone. Inside, the fire burned warm against the winter chill, golden lights spilling across the furniture they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Carson's continued opposition, the extension to complete before spring, a garden to plan, perhaps even apple trees to plant along the southern slope. But tonight was for discovering each other, for beginning the journey as husband and wife rather than solitary survivors. As Quinn drew Grace into his embrace, he marveled at how thoroughly she had transformed his understanding of the frontier. The West still took, that much remained true. But with Grace beside him, Quinn finally understood what his father had known and his mother had missed, that what the frontier gave in return, strength, purpose, and the profound joy of building something lasting together, was worth every sacrifice. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing their small ranch in pristine white, while inside, two people who had arrived in Montana alone found in each other the home they'd been seeking all along.